Good evening, traveller. You've wandered into myth-taken dreams, a place where timelines tangle, truths wobble, and bedtime stories rewrite history just enough to make it magical. Each tale unfolds from a library that never existed, where historians whisper with poets and facts arrive fashionably late. Tonight, we unspool another tale from the flickering archive because bedtime deserves a version of history to pique the imagination. So fluff your pillow, turn down the logic, and lean into the lore. Once upon a time, in a very large, vastly complicated kingdom called the Roman Empire, which, by the way, had far too many roads and people in togas, there was a very grand idea. Let's make everything better by taking over everything. The Romans, being sensible sorts of people, decided this was a splendid idea. They built an empire so huge it stretched across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, and I do mean stretched. It had everything: grand marble temples, impressive amphitheaters for watching people throw things at each other, and a tendency to declare victory even when it wasn't entirely clear who had won. Now, it must be said, the Romans were rather good at what they did. They made brilliant roads, some of which are still being found under parking lots, invented aqueducts, which are just fancy pipes that carry water, and even had some rather fancy parties with lions and occasionally actual feasts that would make you rethink your next birthday party. But, like all grand things, the Roman Empire had a teensy problem. Actually, it had several teensy problems, which, when combined, made the whole thing very wobbly, like a very tall tower made of mismatched bricks. So, what were these problems, you ask? Problem number one. The empire was really, really big. Now, really big can be wonderful, until you realize it's so big you can't keep track of everything. Imagine trying to run a lemonade stand that covers 3 whole counties, and you need to get a lemonade order from one side to the other without it going sour in the sun. Not easy. So the Romans decided, why not split things up a bit? They made 2 halves: the Western Roman Empire, which, for reasons unknown, was based in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which, logically, was based in Constantinople, which was not at all confusing. But, as you might guess, splitting things up didn't exactly help. The Western Empire, located in the part of the world where people wore more sandals than winter coats, had a tendency to fall apart at the edges, while the Eastern Empire, in the chilly East, where everyone thought about things in a more orderly way, seemed to be doing just fine. The Western Empire, on the other hand, started having a few issues, like the fact that it was constantly under attack from people who didn't have to worry about toga sales or marble floors. Problem number 2, the barbarians. Speaking of people who didn't care about togas or marble floors, the Romans had a small minor issue with some very, very enthusiastic tribes who lived just outside the empire. These groups were known as the barbarians, and they were always popping up from the north like a particularly chaotic game of whack-a-mole. The Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, and Huns were just a few of the barbarian groups who liked nothing better than invading the Roman Empire. Not because they hated togas, most of them had never even seen one, but because they were very good at raiding. The Romans had spent a lot of time in the past conquering other people's lands, but now it seemed it was their turn to be invaded. This, understandably, caused a few problems, especially when entire cities were overrun by people who didn't really know how to read the Senate's minutes or discuss philosophy at dinner. These invaders didn't care about Roman traditions, like wearing sandals or attending fancy feasts. They were more interested in plundering and having a good time. As you can imagine, this didn't go over very well in Rome. Problem number 3. The Romans were getting tired. Now, Romans had always been very proud of their work ethic and superior military tactics, but there comes a point when even the best of armies gets a little tired. The legions, who had once conquered the world, found themselves stuck fighting wars on multiple fronts, dealing with barbarians, plagues, economic troubles, and the general stress of being in charge of absolutely everything. Their armor got heavier, their shields got smaller, and their enthusiasm for charging headlong into battle seemed to, well, dwindle. On top of that, Roman soldiers were getting fewer and fewer. And when it became harder to find enough strong young Romans willing to pick up a sword and march into battle, the Romans began hiring mercenaries, people who would fight for pay, but didn't exactly have the same commitment to the empire as a real Roman soldier. The problem with mercenaries is that they can be a bit iffy when it comes to loyalty. They fight because it's a job, not because they want to defend the honor of the empire. So when things started to go pear-shaped, the mercenaries were much less likely to stick around. Problem number 4. Too much empire drama. You know how sometimes a family can be ruined by too much drama? Well, the Roman Empire was a little bit like that, but on a larger scale and with way more civic meetings. There were constant power struggles, and emperors would get crowned, overthrown, crowned again, and occasionally turned into statues with really unflattering hairstyles. The Romans, who had once been quite good at picking strong, decisive leaders, now found themselves with rulers who were more interested in arguing than actually fixing problems. You see, an empire this big couldn't run on just any old emperor. You needed someone who could juggle military might, manage trade, please the people, keep the Senate happy, and stop the barbarians from turning up every Tuesday to cause trouble. But by the time the Romans had a few not-so-terrific emperors, some of whom were quite bad at their jobs, the whole place began to fall apart. It was like trying to build a castle with soggy bricks and a lot of very unhappy pigeons. The final straw. The fall, or, more accurately, the slow collapse. And then, in the year 476 AD, which sounds much more dramatic when written in Roman numerals, the Western Roman Empire had had enough. The last emperor, a chap named Romulus Augustulus, who, quite frankly, had the worst name in all of history, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer. Odoacer, who did not wear a toga, marched into Rome and said, "Well, that's that then." And just like that, the mighty Western Roman Empire came to an end, not with a glorious battle or a thundering final stand, but with a gentle, anticlimactic shrug. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, which had become known as the Byzantine Empire, carried on for a little while longer. But, as we all know, it's hard to keep a kingdom going when the other half of your empire is already on fire. Moral of the story: empires are like togas. They look really impressive when you first put them on, but after a while they get a bit too big, too hot, and rather uncomfortable. Eventually, they need a new tailor. And that's how the Roman Empire, once grand, once powerful, once the owner of every cool statue and most of the goats, met its slow, squishy end. The end, or rather, the beginning, of a lot of medieval history, which is like Roman history, but with fewer togas and more castles.